as Major Thomas Thornburgh's troops neared Milk Creek, the sacred boundary of the Ute Reservation. They crossed paths with weathered civilian teamsters. The men carried a chilling warning from Chief Colorow: "Cross that creek, and you'll ignite a war." Thornburgh, undeterred by the ominous words, shrugged off the threat and pressed forward, his boots kicking up dust toward Milk Creek. On the 29th of September, 1879, a day seared into history, as the Meeker Massacre unfolded. A column of 200 U.S. soldiers under Thornburgh's command marched boldly toward the Ute Reservation. Just 17 miles from the White River Indian Agency, they breached the forbidden border. In an instant, chaos erupted like a storm breaking over the plains. A force of 200 Ute warriors ambushed them, their war cries piercing the air. The soldiers scrambled, forming a desperate wagon corral for defense and dispatching a messenger to plead for rescue. What followed was a grueling week-long battle, one of the most relentless clashes of the Old West. The spark for this inferno at Milk Creek, 17 miles north of modern-day Meeker, was the brazen violation of Ute territory by U.S. troops. It unleashed a rebellion at the nearby White River Indian Agency, a fiery reckoning born from years of festering tensions. In those fateful days, 19 Ute warriors, 24 soldiers, and 11 white agency workers lost their lives. The Utes, steadfast in honoring the 1868 treaty signed by Chief Ouray in Washington, D.C., believed it guaranteed them vast swaths of western Colorado. Yet, waves of prospectors, miners, and settlers, hungry for gold and silver, flooded Denver and the Colorado mountains, trampling the promises of that treaty. The 7 Ute bands of Colorado and Utah saw the 1868 treaty as a shield to keep settlers out, not a cage to trap them within. But earlier, treaties had already carved away their lands, first in 1849, surrendering northern New Mexico, and then in 1863, stripping them of lands east of the Continental Divide. By 1868, the hunger for gold pushed prospectors to demand even more. Chief Ouray, standing tall among his fellow chiefs, returned to Washington, D.C., where he delivered a haunting truth. The agreement an Indian makes with a U.S. treaty is like a buffalo pierced by a hunter's arrows, helpless. It can only collapse and surrender. His words echoed the bitter reality of a people betrayed. The 1868 treaty drew a line at the 107th meridian, near today's Aspen Village, encircling a shrinking territory framed by the Yampa and White Rivers to the north, Utah to the west, and New Mexico to the south. Once, the Utes roamed freely across Colorado, Utah, parts of New Mexico, and even hunted as far as Arizona, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. Their oral traditions whispered of ancient ties to the lands of northern New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah. Into this fraught landscape stepped Nathan Meeker. After failing to sustain his utopian Union colony in 1869 at what is now Greeley, Colorado, and drowning in debt from his newspaper venture, Meeker seized a lifeline in 1878 when President Rutherford B. Hayes appointed him Indian agent at the White River Indian Agency, deep in the heart of Ute territory. Indian agents, handpicked by presidents, were emissaries bridging native nations and the U.S. Bureau of Indian Affairs. They oversaw trade and pushed American ideals onto native communities. Meeker, however, was consumed by a zealous mission to transform the free-spirited nomadic Utes into sedentary Christian farmers. To him, agriculture was the only righteous path for the land, and the Utes' hunting seasons and wandering ways were a sin to be eradicated. The Utes, who owned little beyond their vast herds of horses and lived as one with the earth, stood in stark contrast to Meeker's vision. He boldly claimed he could solve the Western native problem by preaching private land ownership to a people who belonged to the land itself. Historically, the Utes were a tapestry of family bands, woven into 7 distinct groups, each led by its own chiefs until 1868, when the U.S. government crowned Chief Ray of the Uncompahgre Band as leader of all Utes. When not hunting, the Utes reveled in horse racing on tracks carved into the earth. Meeker, blind to their joy, vowed to plow over these tracks and fertile grazing lands to plant crops, promising a better life they never sought. As the government's representative, Meeker's duty was clear: distribute annuity goods to the Utes' food and supplies promised in the 1868 treaty as compensation for their lost ancestral lands and hunting grounds. But his actions would sow the seeds of conflict, setting the stage for a clash that would echo through history. Nathan Meeker tried to outsmart the Utes with a divide-and-conquer tactic, convincing a handful to settle down and farm, while most dug in their heels, camping nearby in defiance. His plan fell apart fast. The Utes' trust in Meeker crumbled when he cut off the government supplies, food, and goods promised in the 1868 treaty if they didn't follow his orders to farm. Meeker wanted the Utes to ditch their hunting traditions for plows. When they refused, he held back their rations, claiming shipments were stuck somewhere along the trail. This pushed the Utes to hunt even more, which infuriated Meeker, who saw it as a direct challenge to his vision of turning them into farmers. With winter closing in, Meeker's ration cuts left many Utes hungry, their faith in him shattered. Chiefs Ouray, Nicaagat, Canavish, and Colorow saw the flood of white settlers as an unstoppable force, and Meeker's actions only deepened their suspicions. Quinkin, an elder of the White River Band, lived in a house Meeker's agency had built for him, perhaps softened by years of watching his world change. But Canavish, a respected medicine man, stayed true to tradition, living in a teepee at the agency. Quinkin might have been open to adapting at first, worn down by the relentless tide of change. Colorow, leading about 200 followers, and Nicaagat's band were far less willing, setting up camp south of the agency in a show of resistance. Colorow's distrust of settlers turned to outright hostility after his son was shot under questionable circumstances in August 1878 by a sheriff's posse in Middle Park, near what's now Granby, Colorado. The Utes kept hunting north of the reservation, as the 1868 treaty allowed, venturing into North Park above modern-day Hayden. But settlers pinned every crime, skirmish, and wildfire in the tinder-dry summer of 1879 on them, fueling a statewide demand to drive the Utes out. As buffalo and other game vanished, hunted to near extinction by white hunters feeding mining camps, the Utes relied more on the government rations Meeker controlled. He used these as a leash, doling them out only to those who obeyed his rules. In August 1879, Nicaagat, a sharp and determined negotiator, rode to Denver to confront Governor Frederick Pitkin. "Meeker's no good," he said bluntly. "Someone's spreading lies to the newspapers. The Utes want peace. We don't dig up the ground and ruin the grass. My people hunt to survive." Pitkin, known for pushing native removal, brushed him off, saying everyone had to work, and the Utes, holding nearly a third of Colorado, could get rich by mining or farming their land. Horses, a cornerstone of Ute life since they acquired them from the Spanish in the 1600s, were everything to them. Meeker, though, saw their vast herds as a problem, arguing they got in the way of farming. This demand to give up their horses hit the Utes hard. It was a line they wouldn't cross. Their entire way of life revolved around those animals. Tensions boiled over when Meeker got into a physical altercation with Chief Canavish over the horse issue. Panicked, Meeker sent a telegram on the 10th of September, 1879, to the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Washington, D.C. "I've been attacked by Chief Canavish. Plowing has stopped. My life, my family, and my workers are in danger. I need protection now." His urgent plea reached the War Department and General William T. Sherman, who ordered 3 companies of cavalry and mounted infantry from Fort Steele to march to the White River Agency. When Ute scouts learned of troops mobilizing at Fort Steele near Rawlins, alarm spread through their camps. The memory of the Sand Creek Massacre, where Cheyenne and Arapaho were slaughtered 15 years earlier, fueled their fears. Convinced the approaching soldiers meant to wipe them out, the Utes readied to defend their land if the 1868 treaty boundary at Milk Creek was crossed. Ute scouts brought grim news. U.S. cavalry was mobilizing at Fort Steele near Rawlins, ready to march south. Haunted by the Sand Creek Massacre 15 years earlier, where a peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho village was butchered, the Utes feared the worst. They braced for war. Meanwhile, Nathan Meeker, rattled by the rising tensions, stopped his plowing efforts and retreated to his home with his family. Meeker had dug his own grave. He fed exaggerated stories to newspapers, lied to the Utes about their promised supplies, denied calling for troops when he had, and claimed the government backed slaughtering their horses to make way for crops and cattle. On the 21st of September, 1879, Major Thomas Tipton Thornburgh marched out of Fort Steele with 200 soldiers, a surgeon, officers, scouts, over 300 horses and mules, and 25 wagons loaded with 30 days' worth of supplies. Their mission? Deliver a show of force to the Ute reservation's edge and back Meeker if needed. Thornburgh kept his options open, planning to camp at the reservation border and size up the situation. But when Ute chiefs learned Meeker had summoned troops, they were furious. Nicaagat, a seasoned negotiator who had dealt with white men before, tried to reason with Meeker, but the agent locked himself in his house, refusing to talk. Undeterred, Nicaagat and a small group of Utes rode out to intercept Thornburgh on his way to Milk Creek. First, Nicaagat stopped at Peck's store in Hayden, buying 10,000 rounds of ammunition as a precaution and sending 2 men to deliver it to the Ute camp. As the army crossed the Yampa River, Nicaagat found Thornburgh's camp nearby. The 2 men, who had built trust when Nicaagat scouted for the army years before, struck a deal. Thornburgh would bring just 5 men to the agency to check on Meeker's situation, aiming to avoid a fight and decide if further advance was necessary. But trouble was brewing. If troops crossed Milk Creek into the reservation, Colorow and Canavish, watching from Yellowjacket Pass, were ready. They had gathered about 200 armed warriors, hidden along the ridges where the canyon trail narrowed toward the agency. Quinkin stayed back at the agency with a smaller group of fighters, while Ute women and children fled south to safety. As Thornburgh's men neared Milk Creek, the reservation's boundary, civilian teamsters warned them of Colorow's ultimatum: cross the creek, and it's war. Thornburgh dismissed the threat and pushed forward, arriving on the 29th of September, 1879, 17 miles northeast of today's Meeker. The creek led into a tight canyon. By midday on the 29th of September, with Milk Creek's dry banks offering little water or pasture, Thornburgh, on his scout's advice, decided to shift camp south to Little Beaver Creek, just inside the reservation. From there, he planned to ride unarmed with 5 men to the agency, as agreed with Nicaagat. But word of Thornburgh's talks with Meeker hadn't reached Colorow's restless warriors on the ridges. When Nicaagat rode to meet Thornburgh and saw troops moving toward better water, he wondered if Thornburgh had broken his promise. He raced to Colorow's group, urging them to hold fire so he could still talk with Thornburgh. At the same time, Lieutenant Samuel A. Cherry, leading a scouting detail, spotted Colorow's warriors poised to defend the boundary. Cherry rushed back to warn Thornburgh, who ordered his main force to fall back and form a defensive wagon corral on the north meadow by Milk Creek. Cherry waved his hat and shouted to the Utes on the ridge, hoping to talk, while Thornburgh rode slowly back to the corral, trying to avoid sparking a fight. Tension snapped like a taut rope. A single shot rang out, and the battle exploded. The cavalry scouts scrambled, fighting as they retreated. A group of Utes swung behind Cherry's men and Thornburgh, clashing as the main troops formed the wagon corral. The Utes holding the high ground moved fast to outflank the cavalry, cutting them off from Lieutenant James Paddock's company, guarding the supply wagons on a flat butte above Milk Creek. Hearing gunfire, Paddock quickly circled the wagons. A Ute sharpshooter took aim, and a bullet struck Thornburgh in the head, dropping him from his horse 500 yards from the corral. The soldiers tightened their wagon circle, yokes and tongues facing inward. They stacked supplies, pitched tents to block sight lines, dug trenches, and piled dirt into a defensive breastwork, bracing for a long siege. Bullets flew thick, and both sides took heavy losses. Early in the fight, the Utes set fire to the brush south of the wagons, but the soldiers stamped it out before the flames reached them. At the north end, Captain Payne used the wind to burn the grass outside the corral, denying the Utes cover as they tried to surround the barricade. He also torched a group of civilian wagons 50 yards away to keep their supplies out of Ute hands, a move that worked. The Utes shifted to cover on the hill above the road. Rain and snow mixed into a brutal mess of mud, blood, and rotting carcasses, with dying animals adding to the chaos. Soldiers stacked dead horses and mules into the breastwork, alongside canvas-wrapped fallen comrades, firing back from behind the grim barricade. Any movement drew Ute sharpshooters' fire. Nighttime dashes to Milk Creek, 300 yards away, for water turned into deadly ambushes. The battle hardened into a grueling standoff, with the Utes holding the offensive edge around the soldiers' entrenched position. As the first shots thundered at Milk Creek, pinning U.S. troops in a desperate fight against the Utes, a Ute messenger raced 17 miles south to the White River Indian Agency. He delivered a bombshell to Chief Quinkin. U.S. soldiers had crossed the Milk Creek boundary, an act of war, and were coming to arrest the chiefs. To the Utes, this confirmed their worst fears. The troops were set to storm the agency all along. Furious over the illegal invasion and Meeker's lies about not calling in the troops, Quincke forced Meeker to act. He demanded Meeker send a last-ditch messenger to negotiate with Major Thornburgh. Unknown to those at the agency, Thornburgh was already dead, struck down in the battle, and the messenger never made it, killed on the road to Milk Creek. That same afternoon, 20 warriors fresh from the Milk Creek fight charged into the agency. A group of Utes already at the agency joined the attack, unleashing gunfire on the workers. Meeker's last-minute peace envoy, Harry Dresser, was still on his way to Milk Creek, hoping to broker a truce with the army. The agency workers fired back, but they were quickly overwhelmed in a brutal onslaught. Women and children fled, scrambling to hide, only to be captured as hostages. A pivotal moment unfolded on the first night of the battle, shifting the course of the conflict. U.S. Deputy Marshal Joe Rankin, a seasoned scout, slipped out after midnight on the 30th of September, racing from the Milk Creek battlefield toward Rawlins to telegraph for help. He was one of 3 riders sent, hoping at least one would break through. Rankin rode 140 miles in roughly 25 hours, reaching the Rawlins telegraph office to summon reinforcements for the trapped soldiers. One of the other riders stumbled across Captain Francis Dodge, patrolling with 30 Buffalo soldiers north of Hayden. Dodge immediately turned south, marching 70 miles to Milk Creek to bolster the besieged troops. They arrived on the 1st of October, charging through gunfire, boosting morale, and strengthening the embattled soldiers' defenses. News reached Colonel Wesley Merritt at Fort David A. Russell in Cheyenne, Wyoming. He called for backup troops from other garrisons, sending them by train to Rawlins. With 500 men, Merritt set out to turn the tide, arriving at Milk Creek on the 5th of October. Just as his forces rolled in, a Ute messenger sent by Chief Ouray appeared, urging an end to the fighting. The gunfire stopped, and the Utes pulled back. With their retreat, Merritt moved his troops south along Milk Creek, out of range of the Utes' new positions. Officers reported the Utes numbered in the hundreds, well armed with plenty of ammunition. Merritt believed more Utes were coming from the Winter Reservation in Utah and from the southern Utes, but Chief Ouray had actually held the southern Utes back. In the end, the Utes withdrew completely. Thornburgh's troops, now led by the wounded Captain Payne, held out through the siege. The army suffered heavy losses: 24 soldiers killed, 44 wounded, and 127 horses and 183 mules dead. The Utes lost 19 warriors, with an unknown number injured. Merritt kept his large camp in place, waiting for orders, which pushed the Utes to scatter and melt into camps to the west and south. 12 days later, Meeker and his men were found, their bodies showing signs of torture and mutilation. At first, the women taken captive said they were treated well. After 23 days, Chief Ouray secured their release. But later, they changed their story, claiming they had been assaulted, fueling anti-Ute anger. In 1880, just months before his death, Chief Ouray traveled by train to Washington, D.C. There, he met President Rutherford B. Hayes and signed a document, not a treaty, forcing the surrender of all northern Utes. The Uncompahgre and White River bands were sent to the Uintah and Ouray reservations, merged into one in 1886 in northeast Utah. Only a small patch of land in southern Colorado remained for the Utes. Chief Ouray died in his Colorado homeland before his people were forced to leave. Some Utes, like the Colorado band, roamed freely between the Utah reservations and western Colorado for a time, but by 1887, they too were confined to the reservation,